The invoice email arrived at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, addressed to an account I didn't recognize, and I only saw it because Whitney's laptop had synced to our shared home printer and spat out a stray page onto our kitchen counter before I left for work. My name is Lucas. I'm 41 years old. I teach high school chemistry here in Richmond and tutor SAT prep on weekends to help cover the mortgage, and 8 months before that stray page landed on my counter, my wife Whitney had stood in our kitchen holding a receipt for my own therapy copay and said, in a tone I can still hear if I let myself, $200 a session for someone to just nod at you. That's an expensive babysitter, Lucas. I'd laughed it off at the time, the way you laugh off things that are actually landing somewhere deep and quiet inside you, because that's easier than admitting how much they cost. The printed page on the counter that Tuesday was an invoice, not from any life coach or wellness service Whitney had ever mentioned to me, but from a name I didn't recognize, Dr. Marian Castellano, LCSW, for a session dated the previous Thursday, the same Thursday Whitney had told me she was at a client walkthrough 3 hours away in Charlottesville. I stood there in my socks on the kitchen tile holding a piece of paper that shouldn't have existed, according to everything I understood about my wife's schedule, and felt something far stranger than jealousy or suspicion. I felt recognition. Because I knew that name. Dr. Marian Castellano ran a small practice 2 floors below my own therapist's office, in the same converted Victorian on Grove Avenue where I'd been going every other Tuesday for the better part of a year, ever since my own doctor finally convinced me that the tightness in my chest and the sleeplessness weren't going to fix themselves. I want to tell you how I got to that kitchen counter, because the invoice wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the moment 8 months of quiet, mounting unease finally had a name attached to it, and a floor number, and a Thursday I now understood I'd never actually been told the truth about. Whitney and I met in our late 20s through mutual friends at a wedding in Charlotte, and what drew me to her was a kind of forward momentum I didn't have myself. She always knew what she wanted next, professionally, socially, in a way that felt, in those early years, like exactly the ballast my more cautious temperament needed. 12 years and 2 kids later, Nora, 11, quiet and observant in the specific way oldest children often are, and Sam, 7, still young enough that most of what happened this year passed over him like weather. I would have told you, if you'd asked me any time before that Tuesday, that we had a good marriage. Not perfect. Good. My own blind spot, the one I have to own honestly here, is a need for control dressed up as competence. I like understanding the mechanics of things, chemistry most of all, and I'd spent years applying that same instinct to my marriage, quietly managing our finances, our schedules, our 5-year plans, in a way that left less and less room for Whitney to actually need anything from me directly, because I'd already anticipated and handled it before she asked. I thought that was love. I understand now it was also, in its own way, a kind of control that slowly crowded out the space where real vulnerability between us might otherwise have lived. The anxiety that eventually sent me into therapy had been building for nearly 2 years before I booked that first appointment, a slow accumulation of sleepless nights, a persistent hum of dread I couldn't attach to any single cause, worsened by a difficult stretch at school involving a formal complaint from a parent that turned out to be baseless but shook my confidence for months afterward. My doctor suggested therapy the way doctors do, almost as an afterthought, and something about the suggestion landed harder than I expected. I found Dr. Elena Marsh through a colleague's recommendation, and within a few sessions I understood I'd found someone who was actually going to help me instead of just listening politely. When I told Whitney I'd started seeing someone, she didn't erupt, exactly. She just went quiet in a specific way, set down whatever she was holding, and said the line about the babysitter a week later, once she'd had time to sit with it. I told myself her reaction was about her own discomfort with vulnerability rather than truly about me. I kept going anyway, quietly, the way I did most things that mattered more to me than to her. What I didn't understand yet, what I wouldn't understand for months, was that Whitney's contempt for my therapy wasn't really contempt for therapy itself. It was something closer to fear, though I had no idea yet what that fear was actually about. Small things accumulated that spring that I noticed and set aside without real weight. Whitney's client work, always somewhat unpredictable given the nature of interior design consulting, started requiring more overnight trips to Charlottesville for a large commercial project she described only in vague, general terms whenever I asked follow-up questions. She started taking calls from her business partner, a woman named Renata, in the car with the garage door down instead of inside the house. She said the calls needed quiet concentration. I accepted that explanation completely. There was a Thursday in April when Whitney came home from Charlottesville smelling faintly of a hand sanitizer with a specific medicinal, almost clinical scent that struck me as odd for someone who'd supposedly spent the day on a construction walkthrough. I mentioned it lightly. She said the site had renovation dust everywhere and she'd been washing her hands constantly. I accepted that too. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever built a whole comfortable structure of explanations around small details that didn't quite fit, rather than asking one direct question, you understand exactly how much quiet effort that structure takes to maintain, and how thoroughly you can convince yourself the effort is simply patience. My closest friend, a fellow teacher named Desmond who'd known Whitney nearly as long as I had, mentioned once at a barbecue that he'd run into her getting coffee near Grove Avenue on a weekday when she told me she was in Charlottesville. He said it lightly, assumed I knew, assumed there was some simple explanation. I said, yeah, probably a supplier meeting downtown, and moved the conversation along fast enough that Desmond didn't push further. I understand now that my own quick deflection told him more than my words did, and that his choice not to press it wasn't malicious. It was the same instinct that had let me build my own structure of explanations, a friend deciding, quietly, that it wasn't his place to hand me a suspicion I hadn't asked for. By early summer, 6 months into my own therapy and roughly the same span into whatever was actually happening on those Thursdays, the accumulated small wrongness had a shape I could no longer avoid entirely, even if I still hadn't said a word to Whitney about any of it. The Charlottesville project, according to Whitney, kept extending, a commercial build-out that seemed to require an unusual number of overnight trips for a job whose scope, when I asked casual questions about it, never seemed to have grown correspondingly larger. I noticed this. I told myself commercial design projects probably ran that way, unpredictably, and I had no real basis for comparison. Whitney's behavior escalated in its own quiet way that summer, each sign a little louder than the one before, though I kept finding softer explanations for nearly all of them. She started keeping her phone face down more consistently, a habit shift I clocked within the first couple of weeks and chalked up to general work stress. She began showering the moment she got home from Charlottesville trips, before even greeting the kids, something new that year, and when I mentioned it once, she said the drive left her feeling grimy and she just wanted to feel like herself again before dinner. There was an evening at Nora's school orchestra recital where Whitney excused herself twice to take work calls, gone nearly 20 minutes each time, and returned the second time with her makeup touched up in a way that hadn't been there when she left. I noticed the detail. I filed it. I didn't ask. The specific piece of information that finally didn't fit any explanation I'd already built came through Nora, in the unguarded way children deliver their most accurate observations. She mentioned, over dinner one evening, that she'd seen a car in a parking garage downtown that looked just like Mom's, except Mom said she was in Charlottesville that day, so I guess I was wrong, delivered with the flat, easily corrected logic of an 11-year-old who trusted her own mother's word over her own eyes. I remember the specific, small lurch in my stomach hearing that. I told Nora she was probably right, there are lots of cars that look alike, and changed the subject. I didn't ask her a single follow-up question. I understand now that I did the same thing to my own daughter that Desmond had done to me, noticed a detail and actively chose not to pursue it, because pursuing it meant risking a truth I wasn't ready to hold. That detail seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't. I called it a coincidence then. I wouldn't call it that anymore. At my own therapy sessions that summer, Dr. Marsh noticed something in how I talked about Whitney that I hadn't fully registered myself, a pattern of preemptively excusing her behavior before I'd even finished describing it, explaining away my own unease in the same sentence I raised it. She didn't tell me what that meant. She just asked, gently, why I always seemed to arrive at forgiveness before I'd let myself sit with the actual discomfort. I didn't have a good answer that day. She told me, much later, what those Charlottesville trips actually looked like from her side, something I want to include here because it reframes the entire shape of what I thought I understood. I told myself, the first time I found Marion's practice, that it was just curiosity. I'd heard her name from a client whose own marriage had gone through something rough, and I told myself I just wanted to understand what therapy actually did, since Lucas seemed to be getting something from it I didn't understand and privately resented him for having. The first session, I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry in years, about things that had nothing to do with Lucas directly, my own mother's illness the year before, a career I'd built that felt increasingly hollow, a specific fear that I'd become someone who managed a household instead of someone who mattered on her own terms. I told myself continuing to see Marion was different from what Lucas was doing, because I was lying about it, and somehow the lying felt like it kept it smaller, more controllable, less like the thing I'd mocked him for needing. I told myself the Charlottesville lies were harmless because the work trips were real, mostly. I just extended them, tacked an extra session onto each one, told myself the deception was protecting something rather than damaging it. I couldn't look at Lucas some evenings without a specific, hot shame, not because Marion and I were doing anything wrong exactly, but because I was actively hiding the one thing that might have actually helped our marriage, out of a pride I didn't examine closely enough to name. That's what she told me. I had no idea, that whole summer, that the woman I'd married was 2 floors below my own therapist's office on the very days she claimed to be somewhere else entirely, pursuing, in her own secretive way, almost exactly what I was pursuing openly. By late summer, I'd started, almost without admitting it to myself, cross-referencing Whitney's Charlottesville trips against our shared calendar and our joint credit card statements, a habit that felt uncomfortably like something a suspicious husband does, which is exactly what I was becoming, though I still resisted naming it that plainly. The turn from vague unease to something requiring an actual answer came on that Tuesday morning with the stray invoice on the counter, Dr. Marion Castellano, LCSW, a session dated the previous Thursday, the same day Whitney had told me she was 3 hours away in Charlottesville. I sat with that invoice for a long time before I let myself understand its full implication. My first instinct, genuinely, was concern rather than suspicion, a flash of worry that Whitney might be struggling with something serious enough to hide from me entirely, followed almost immediately by a colder, more complicated calculation once I placed the name. Grove Avenue. The converted Victorian. 2 floors below Dr. Marsh's office, where I'd been sitting in the waiting room every other Tuesday for nearly a year. I didn't confront her immediately. I told myself I needed to understand the actual shape of what I was looking at before I said anything I couldn't take back. I called the billing office for the practice's shared front desk. The Victorian housed several independent practitioners under one administrative umbrella, under the pretense of confirming my own account details, and in the process learned, almost incidentally, that Whitney's sessions with Dr. Castellano had been ongoing for exactly 7 months, scheduled, without exception, on the same Thursdays she'd told me she'd be in Charlottesville. Every apparent lead I might have chased that week threatened to collapse into something both smaller and stranger than an affair. Maybe this was simply Whitney's own private therapy, kept secret out of the exact shame and pride she'd built around mocking mine, and nothing more sinister than that. I wanted, in a strange way, for that to be the whole truth. I understand now that wanting the smaller, less devastating explanation is its own kind of devotion, and devotion doesn't make an explanation correct. I went further than I'm proud of that week. I mentioned, carefully, during my own session with Dr. Marsh, that I'd learned my wife was seeing someone in the same building, and asked, half hoping she'd simply say she couldn't discuss it, whether she knew Dr. Castellano professionally. Dr. Marsh, appropriately, said only that professional ethics prevented her from confirming or discussing another client's existence in any capacity, and gently redirected the conversation back to how I was feeling about the discovery itself, which I understood, even in the moment, was exactly the right and only answer she could give. I realized then that I hadn't uncovered a straightforward affair. I'd uncovered something that could be far more benign, a private grief I knew nothing about, or something considerably more complicated, and I had no way to know which without asking directly, a conversation I'd been avoiding, in one form or another, for the better part of a decade. I photographed the invoice before Whitney could notice it was missing from wherever it had printed by accident, gathered the credit card statements showing the pattern of extended Charlottesville trips, and sat with all of it for several days, watching Whitney move through our kitchen with a strange double awareness I didn't know how to switch off, the wife I thought I knew, and whatever second, hidden version of her had been sitting 2 floors beneath my own therapist's office every other Thursday for 7 months. There was a moment that same week I only understood the full shape of much later, one that ran in uneasy parallel with everything I was quietly piecing together. The week Lucas started seeming different, quieter at dinner, watching me a beat too long, I felt something tighten that told me he might have found something, though I didn't know how much. I sat in my car outside Marion's office before what would have been my next Thursday session, phone in my lap, actually composing a message to cancel it, to finally just tell Lucas the truth about all of it before he found it some worse way. I didn't send it. I told myself I needed one more session to figure out how to say it, that walking in and admitting the lie felt harder than continuing it one more week. I understand now that reasoning was mostly fear dressed up as preparation, fear of what it would mean to finally be someone who needed help exactly the way I'd mocked him for needing it. That's what she told me. I didn't know it that Thursday, sitting in my own classroom grading papers, that 40 minutes away, she'd come within one sent message of telling me everything herself. I waited until the kids were at Nora's grandparents' for a Saturday sleepover before I raised it, sitting across from Whitney at our kitchen table with the invoice and the credit card statements between us, no plan beyond simply needing an answer. I didn't lay it out the way I might have planned if I'd been thinking more clearly. Instead, I started doing something I recognize now as its own kind of avoidance, talking myself through possible innocent explanations out loud, offering her outs before she'd even responded, because some part of me still couldn't fully accept what the pattern plainly suggested. Maybe this is just your own therapy, I said. Maybe you needed something private, and I get why you'd want that separate from me, given how I probably made you feel about mine. I was building her defense for her, searching for a version of events that didn't require me to face something harder, because the alternative, a genuine affair, conducted under cover of the exact profession I'd found healing in, cost more than I was ready to pay. She let me talk longer than she needed to. Then she stopped me, with a stillness that didn't match anything I'd braced for. It's not an affair, she said. But it's not just my own therapy either. There's something else you need to know first, and it's going to reframe everything you think you're dealing with right now. She told me then, in a voice that had lost its usual composure, about her mother's death the year before, something she'd shared with me at the time only in its broad outline, a sudden cardiac event, a difficult few months of grief that I'd assumed we'd moved through together, the way I thought we moved through most things. What she'd never told me, she said now, was that her mother's final years had been shadowed by a long, private struggle with alcohol that Whitney had spent most of her adult life quietly managing and hiding from nearly everyone, including me, driving to her mother's apartment at odd hours to handle crises, covering unexplained absences from family gatherings, carrying a decade of exhausting, secret caretaking that had never once been named out loud in our marriage. Marion specializes in adult children of addiction, Whitney said. I found her because I finally couldn't carry all of it alone anymore. I lied about Charlottesville because I couldn't stand the idea of you seeing me the way I'd been treating you, needing help, being fragile, after I'd spent months acting like your therapy was something to be ashamed of. I know how that sounds now. I know it doesn't excuse the lying. But it's the truth, and it's the whole truth, and there's no one else involved in any of it. The revelation didn't excuse 7 months of deliberate deception, and Whitney didn't ask me to treat it as though it did, but it reframed the entire shape of what I thought I'd walked into that kitchen to confront, replacing a story about betrayal with something sadder and more complicated, a decade of private grief she'd never let either of us properly name. She finally spoke again, after a silence that stretched long enough that neither of us had touched our coffee. This is what she told me next, as close to her words as I can hold on to now. It started the week after Mom died, when I realized I'd spent 10 years managing her drinking so thoroughly that I didn't actually know how to grieve her, I only knew how to manage the aftermath of her, which is a different thing entirely. I found Marion through a client who'd been through something similar, and the first session, I told myself I'd go once, just to see, and then I kept going because stopping meant sitting alone with all of it again. I lied about Charlottesville the first time almost by accident. The trip was real, I just added an extra day, and once the lie worked, it became the easiest shape to keep using. I couldn't look at you some mornings without feeling like a hypocrite standing in my own kitchen, especially after everything I'd said about your therapy being weakness. I tried to tell you twice. Both times I lost my nerve at the door. I don't have a clean reason why admitting I needed help felt so much harder than actually getting it. I just know I chose the lie every single Thursday because it felt smaller than the truth, right up until it very obviously wasn't. That's what she told me. I sat there for a long time afterward, holding two things at once: relief that this wasn't the betrayal I'd braced for, and a real, separate grief of my own that she'd carried a decade of her mother's addiction without ever once letting me help carry it with her. I want to be honest that the story doesn't end with simple relief, because what Whitney revealed, even without an affair attached to it, was its own kind of betrayal, not of fidelity, but of the basic premise I thought our marriage operated on, that we told each other the true shape of our struggles instead of managing them separately behind convenient cover stories. We didn't divorce over this, not immediately, and for a while I genuinely believed we might work through it together. We tried, for several months, attending a few joint sessions with a marriage counselor Dr. Marsh recommended, someone entirely separate from both Marion and Elena to avoid any conflict of professional interest. What became clear in those sessions, slowly and then all at once, wasn't that Whitney had betrayed me with another person, but that we had each, independently, built entire private architectures of coping, mine open and hers hidden, and that the marriage itself had quietly become a structure where neither of us fully expected the other to be trusted with the truth. The consequence Whitney faced wasn't a courtroom or a public reckoning. It was smaller and, in its own way, harder. The specific trust Nora and Sam had in the ordinary honesty of their parents' marriage took a real hit once the broad outline of the lie became something they were old enough, especially Nora, to partly understand. Whitney lost, too, the image of herself as someone who'd handled her mother's death and her own grief with quiet strength, the story she told herself and everyone around her, replaced now with the harder, more honest understanding that quiet strength and quiet concealment had been, for her, nearly indistinguishable for most of her adult life. We separated 8 months after that kitchen table conversation, not out of anger exactly, but out of a mutual, exhausted recognition that whatever trust had once let us build a life together had been damaged in a way that months of joint counseling hadn't fully repaired. The divorce was quiet, without lawyers weaponizing anything. We split custody evenly, sold the house, and both, separately, kept seeing our respective therapists through the process. I met someone the following year, a woman named Priya who taught at a neighboring school and whom I met, appropriately enough, through Desmond, who'd spent the intervening months processing his own guilt about not saying more back at that barbecue. I didn't rush into anything. I took the specific lesson I'd learned from all of this seriously, that a relationship built on managing each other's difficulties quietly, rather than being trusted with them directly, isn't actually intimacy, no matter how functional it looks from the outside. Priya and I built something different, slower, with more honest, occasionally uncomfortable conversations than Whitney and I had ever really had. I used to think my own therapy was simply about managing my anxiety, a private project separate from my marriage. I understand now that the real value of it was smaller and larger than that. It taught me, specifically, how to sit with discomfort instead of immediately managing it away, a skill I'd needed in my marriage for years before I ever had language for what was missing. If you've ever mocked someone for seeking help, or been mocked for it yourself, and later discovered the person doing the mocking was quietly seeking their own, I think you understand exactly what that kitchen table felt like, the strange vertigo of finding out the thing you'd been shamed for was something the other person needed just as badly, in secret. I think about that stray invoice sometimes, the accident of a shared printer that revealed something Whitney might otherwise have carried alone for years. Most of us have some version of that invoice waiting to print somewhere in our own lives, a truth about someone we love that's closer to the surface than either of us realizes. The question worth asking isn't whether we'll eventually find it. It's whether, once we do, we're willing to meet what's underneath it with curiosity instead of the easier, more familiar reflex of assuming the worst. Nora asked me once, months after the divorce was final, whether Mom and I were still friends. I told her we were something more complicated than friends and less than enemies, two people who'd built her and Sam together and were still, in our separate, imperfect ways, trying to do right by that. She seemed satisfied with the honesty of the answer, more than she might have been with a simpler, tidier one. There's a specific irony sitting at the center of this story that the ending only partially resolves. A man who found real healing in being honest about his own struggle, married to a woman who mocked that honesty precisely because she was terrified of needing the same thing herself. The invoice that exposed everything wasn't proof of infidelity at all, it was proof of a decade-long pattern of private endurance that had calcified into something neither partner knew how to name until an accident of a shared printer forced the question. What this story reveals, beneath the surface mystery of the Charlottesville trips, is how thoroughly shame can disguise itself as strength. Whitney's contempt for Lucas's therapy wasn't really about him, it was a defense against her own unprocessed decade of managing her mother's addiction, a burden she'd carried so privately that admitting she needed help felt, to her, indistinguishable from admitting the whole structure of her self-reliance had been a performance. Lucas's own blind spot, his instinct to manage rather than ask, meant he spent months building comfortable explanations instead of a single direct question: the cologne, the extended trips, even his own daughter's offhand observation about a familiar car, each one a door he noticed and chose not to open. The real turning point of this story isn't the invoice itself, but the moment in the kitchen when Lucas, prepared to hear about betrayal, instead had to reckon with a different kind of damage, the discovery that two people can share a house, a bed, and 12 years of history while each quietly deciding the other couldn't be trusted with their hardest truths. That reframing, from affair to concealment, doesn't soften the damage. It relocates it, revealing that infidelity isn't the only way a marriage can become a lie. What lingers longest is the quiet suggestion that healing, ultimately, wasn't something either of them could do for the other, only something each of them had to choose, separately and honestly, before any relationship either of them built afterward could hold real weight. The detail I keep returning to is Whitney sitting in her car outside Marion's office, one unsent message away from telling me everything herself, weeks before that stray invoice ever printed. I think about how differently this whole year might have gone if either of us had simply said the harder thing out loud, on purpose, instead of waiting for an accident to say it for us. I've stopped asking whether I should have noticed sooner. The question I sit with now is why it took an accidental piece of paper on a kitchen counter for two people who loved each other to finally tell one truth neither of us had been brave enough to volunteer. If there's someone in your life whose strength has always looked a little too effortless, a little too complete, I'd like to know the one word you'd use for what you think might actually be underneath it. Drop it in the comments. And to whoever stayed with me through this whole story, thank you, genuinely, for sitting with something quieter and stranger than a typical betrayal. I think more marriages carry some version of this hidden weight than any of us like to admit, and I'm grateful you were willing to look at it with me.